And what I love about what's happening in our church is the way people are beginning to choose a fight, to identify with a cause, and to step out in this mission we have as a church of renewing people and renewing places. And today we come to the last message in our Breaking the Pattern series as we open God's Word to the book of Judges. Now, if you're a guest here today, welcome. We love the fact that you're here among us, and we would certainly invite you to participate in this mission we have as well. I'm Jonathan. I'm the senior pastor here at Green Lane Christian Centre. As we open God's Word, or before we open God's Word, I'd like us just to take a moment just to pray and prepare our hearts before God. Father, would you today open our hearts? We want to grow in this relationship with you and receive the affections you have for us. Would you open our eyes? We want to see what you are doing in this world and what you want to do in this world. And open our ears. We want to hear your word clearly, and we want your Spirit to apply it to each part of our life. In Jesus' name, amen. My dad wasted his whole life. Please don't waste yours. The author of a blog wrote that blog I read recently. She was writing about her dad's alcohol-induced rage and the way he would turn on others, including his wife and the son, both of whom thought the world of him. She goes on in her blog, "My father wasted his life. He worked at a job he hated for close to 25 years. He pushed away most of his friends and family with his uncontrollable temper and his refusal to see anyone else's viewpoint. He despised those who found success because he was unwilling to go after it himself. A wasted life." What a horrid eulogy. You know, as a pastor, I've conducted numerous funerals over the years. I love it when I conduct a funeral for people who have lived life with purpose. During the funeral, I'll meet with people and I'll hear all these stories about the wonderful, positive difference this person has made in their life. But sadly, there's been a few funerals where the handful of people gathered were struggling to find anything at all positive to say about the person that had died. On one occasion, I still remember it really clearly, there was absolutely nothing positive the handful of people said as they gathered. Their life never began that way, of course. You know, even in the very worst of environments, every single person has so much promise, so much potential to bring hope to others around them. So why is it that some waste their life? As we open the Bible today, we come to this character that's probably the most familiar to all of us in this book of Judges. His name is Samson. He was one of the leaders at the time that this book of Judges was written, that called Judges. It was a term the people of the time used for the political and military leaders. You can read his story in Judges chapter 13 to 16. When we picture Samson, I think many of us have this image of a kind of a superhero in mind, somebody like this here from the Marvel movies. This is kind of what we think of when we think of Samson, isn't it? You know, this incredible character, strong character. But as you delve into the story, you come to the reality that this is actually a story that's a tragedy. It's a story of a life with so much potential, but ultimately a wasted life. His life didn't need, of course, to be a tragedy, and neither does ours. But perhaps there's something in his story, this story, that will help us understand what it is that causes people to drift away from a life of so much potential and promise and drift away to effectively a wasted life. So far in this book, if you've been around here, you'd see that God has raised up the most unlikely of people to lead others and to break these negative patterns in society. If you'd remember Ehud, a lefty. He used Gideon, a doubter. He used Jephthah, a man from a very dysfunctional past. And in contrast to all these different characters, Samson actually has everything going for him. Samson was a man with so much potential and so much promise. And the text is full of moments in the story leaving us in awe of the potential and the promise of this Thor-like man. It begins with this miraculous birth. Let's read the verses here in chapter 13. In those days, a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan lived in the town of Zorah. His wife was unable to become pregnant, and they had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, even though you've been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. So here you have it, this miracle baby. Manoah and his wife, let's call her Mrs. Manoah, are infertile. God sends his angel with good news, and God is about to step in and raise up a new leader, judge, person, with this very clearly stated purpose to begin to rescue the Israelites from the Philistines. And already in this story, we're left with the impression that this guy is somebody special, that this guy is somebody quite unique right from his conception. Because he has a unique purpose, we read that Samson is to be what ancient Israelites called a Nazirite. Nazirite vow is outlined in other parts of the Bible in a book you can read later in Numbers chapter 6. It's essentially this vow that a person would take as a way to thank God for some special blessing they had in their life, or a way to demonstrate to others a particular focus or intensity. People who took this Nazirite vow basically said three things. I'm going to avoid haircuts, I'm going to have no contact with dead bodies, and I'll avoid wine or anything that comes from kind of grape-based food. Most Nazirite vows were temporary, but there's a few instances like this one where they're lifelong commitments. So Samson takes this Nazirite vow from birth, which meant he had to avoid, haircuts, contact with dead bodies, and wine. After all, passage says here he had a very special purpose. Now tuck that away, because that aspect is going to come in really handy later in our story. Mrs. Manoah names her boy Samson. Samson means something like sun-like, brightness, solar-like. It's the equivalent at the time, I guess, of putting a bumper sticker at the back of your car and saying, my son is something really special. He is going to bring joy and brightness to others. And actually, Mrs. Manoah has every reason to be confident about that. Because right from his birth, here is a man with so much promise, so much potential. Conceived miraculously, he's chosen by God, he's set apart to serve him. The beginning of the story almost leaves us in some suspense, doesn't it? What will he do? What will this super Thor-like character deliverer do to break in and to break the patterns that exist in society? And throughout the story, we see glimpses of this God-given potential. Samson grows up, he meets a girl, he decides to propose to her. On his way to visit her, this lion attacks him. And listen to what happens. A young lion suddenly attacks Samson near the vineyards of Timnah. Don't know why he's around the vineyards, if you remember his Nazirite vow, but anyway. At that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he ripped the lion's jaws apart with his bare hands. I mean, wow, this guy's incredible. In the books I read to my kids, the lion is always the king of the jungle, right? And yet Samson rips a lion apart with his bare hands. I mean, how many of you have ever been around a lion, even touched a lion, let alone rip a lion apart, a live lion apart with your bare hands? I mean, Samson did it. He's an amazing guy. No wonder he's a favorite in all the Sunday school lessons. Incredible strength. And this incredible strength, we're told, comes from God. The Spirit of the Lord, it says, came powerfully upon him. You see, with God on his side, Samson can defeat lions. Not only is his birth miraculous, but he's a lion slayer. And then on top of that, he's this army of one. So the Philistine army march against Samson. Samson by himself marches against the entire army of the Philistines. I mean, imagine the scene as Samson takes on the army single-handedly. I mean, this guy's amazing. In one of those situations, we read that he picks up the jawbone of this dead donkey and he kills 1,000 Philistine enemies with it. I mean, through God's strength, Samson's this army of one. Amazing things. So as I mentioned, I think the picture we have of Samson is much like this guy, Thor. A big muscle guy, That's how we normally see him portrayed in children's Bibles, apart from, the icon Thor. But we see kind of that kind of picture, don't we, in children's Bibles. But I wonder if that's actually the reality. I actually wonder if he looked a bit more like this. Because, okay, it might be a bit of an extreme, but, the Philistines keep trying to work out the secret of his strength. If he was kind of like Thor, makes sense why he's so strong. Just look at him. But if he's I kind of wonder if, maybe he's a bit more like me. If I kind of took on, found some dog bone and took on 1,000 soldiers and won, you'd also be going, how did he do that? I think that's the idea here that comes in the story. Where does Samson's strength come from? We know it comes from God. He was a man of so much potential and promise. There's something special about him. So far in the story, we know he's conceived miraculously. He's chosen by God. He's set apart to serve him. He's given a special purpose. He's empowered by the Spirit. He's given all these special abilities to make a big difference in the world beyond what is natural. Does any of that sound familiar to you? See, maybe you don't know this. Maybe you have forgotten it, or maybe you've never grasped it, but each of those statements is true of you and me. That we are a people who have so much potential and promise. Listen to what Peter says over in the New Testament. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you hadn't received mercy, now you have received mercy. See, as a follower of Jesus, you have a supernatural new birth. You have been chosen by God even before you were born. You've been set apart to serve him in a special way. You've been given a very special purpose. You've been empowered by his Spirit. You've been given these abilities beyond what is natural. What great news. Like Samson, you too have so much potential. You have so much promise. But there's some bad news that can come with this too. And here's the bad news. Though Samson was a man with so much potential and promise, he wasted his life. He is the most flawed leader among all these leaders we've seen in this book. Though he had so much potential and promise, he becomes this violent, impulsive, sexually addicted, emotionally immature, selfish man driven by revenge. Right after this amazing birth we read about, and we read that he wants to get married, we start to realize something is wrong here in this story. We read, one day when Samson was in Timnah, one of the Philistine women caught his eye. Now hold on a second, Samson's meant to be delivering the Israelites from the Philistines, and here he wants to marry one of the Philistines. The alarm bells should already be ringing for us. Goes on. When he returned home, he told his father and mother, a young Philistine woman in Timnah caught my eye. I want to marry her. Get her for me. Now, I don't encourage any single person who wants to be married to apply this as your life verse. It's not a good thing. Literally, the text says, she is right in my eyes. It's a phrase that comes up in the book of Judges quite a few times. It's this idea that people had at the time that whatever feels right must be right. Of course, none of us here would ever have that kind of idea, would we? His parents go on. His father and mother objected. Isn't there even like one woman in our tribe or among all the Israelites you could marry? They asked. Why must you go to the pagan Philistines to find a wife? Samson told his father, get her for me. She looks good to me, feels right, must be right. What a spoiled brat. On the way to the wedding, Samson stops by to look at the place where he had earlier torn that lion in half. Goes across, he finds some honey inside the dead lion's body. Now, remember, a Nazirite is not supposed to touch anything that's dead. But Samson really wants some of that tasty, sweet honey. Now, I doubt whether that's very appetizing to you and me, because we can just go down to the Foursquare and buy a pot of honey. That's kind of easy for us. But Samson probably saw this as a kind of a symbol. He was on his way to his wedding. Throughout the Bible, honey is this kind of symbol of sexual fulfillment. Samson can't resist the temptation, so he reaches down and he scoops some of that honey into his hand, and he eats it. It's a small episode in the story, but I think it's really symbolic about what's going on. I think it's here because it captures much about who Samson is and why his life failed to fire with all its promise and potential. See, while Samson is this lion killer with amazing potential and promise, he also has a sweet tooth that's going to get him into some serious trouble. His eating the honey indicates that he has a big trouble controlling those physical desires within him. His willingness to eat the honey shows that he considers the satisfaction of those physical desires to be more important than any status he has as a Nazirite before God. Though Samson can defeat lions, he has trouble with his sweet tooth. He has trouble with that sweet honey, both the literal kind and the metaphorical kind. So it shouldn't surprise us when that sweet tooth ultimately leads him to get hooked up with a Philistine prostitute named Delilah. See, Delilah's name literally means possessor of dangling curls or flirtatious. She's got the looks. And remember, we've already seen that Samson has a thing for honey and the honeys. So as the story continues, it's obvious that Samson should have been suspicious and realized that Delilah was a threat to his well-being. But you see, Delilah's been paid off by her Philistine peers to find out the secret of Samson's strength. So when Samson lies to her, she keeps nagging him again and again. She questions the love that Samson might have for her. And he decides, get this, he decides that it's more important to keep her than to fulfill his Nazirite status before God. It's classic addiction symptoms all over the story. He's in denial. His sexual addiction blinds him to reality. He tells her the secret of his success, the long hair. She shaves his hair. His strength leaves him. The Philistines capture Samson. They poke out his eyes. The one whose name literally means brightness now finds himself plunged into utter darkness. When I hear the story of Samson told to my kids, Samson is often portrayed much like Superman. And the cutting of his hair is kind of seen like kryptonite to Superman. It kind of sucks away his powers. I don't think it's quite like that. You see, this was the first time, it wasn't the first time that Samson had violated his Nazirite commitment. So why did the strength leave him when he cut his hair? Remember, he wasn't allowed to touch dead bodies either, like the lion before him. But so why did it go now? I don't think there's actually anything magical about his hair. I just think it's kind of the end of the line for God as God watches how Samson's prepared to throw it all away. Before this, God had given Samson every opportunity to discover his God-given purpose in life. After the great victory that God gave him to slay those 1,000 Philistines with a bone of a dead donkey, Samson should have realized that this strength was something special. It had been given to him by God. It was for a divine purpose. It wasn't for some kind of personal vendetta. But when he told Delilah that his long hair was a visible reminder of the special relationship and calling that he had from God, he was in essence saying, your happiness and my sexual satisfaction are more important than anything to do with God. And God would not tolerate that kind of attitude any longer. And God abandoned him. He left him to whatever the consequences would be. You see, I've come across too many times to count now followers of Jesus in the same situation, that they gave up their calling for some cheap thrill. And it is a cheap trade. Samson was meant to bring freedom from the Philistines. How is it that he ends up imprisoned to the Philistines? He was meant to live up to his name, sunlight, bringing brightness and joy, and somehow he ends up blinded and living in utter darkness. Samson was meant to be serving God. How is it that he ends up grinding grain in a prison for Dagon, the god of grain? He's meant to be a servant for God. How is it that he's become a slave to the enemy? In their exuberance, the Philistines hold a party. They boast that their god Dagon is stronger than any other god and Samson's god, and they bring Samson out to entertain them. They take joy in seeing Samson so pathetic, stumbling around in the darkness. And then the story ends, and it has kind of this mixed ending to it. We read, Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me again. Oh God, give me, strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes." It's kind of a mixed ending, isn't it? Samson wishing for his own death, and he kills the Philistines with at least some hint here of personal revenge more than anything just to do with the deliverance of God's people. It was never meant to be this way. He has so much potential. He has so much promise, but he wasted his life. And I think his story has some major implications for you and me as we think about our own life. So let me mention a couple of areas that I think we need to reflect on coming out of this story. First, I want you to see that God embraces people who live wasted lives. See, as you look at your own life, I'm sure there are decisions that have been made. There are things that have been done that you're not proud of. There's nothing positive about them. And as you recall those things, it might fill you with despair. And yet God embraces people with wasted lives or elements in their life that they would rather not remember. He has compassion on people who experience chaos because of their own doing. We see it in the introduction to the story about Samson, because his story actually begins with words we've heard in every single cycle in this book of Judges so far. It begins this way. Again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. Remember that clause has come through every single cycle. So the Lord handed them over to the Philistines, who oppressed them for 40 years. And every other story we've read, this phrase has come through again and again and again. And then straight after that, what's happened is the people have cried out to God for help. And when they've cried out to God for help, God has raised up a leader judge to come to their aid. So we would kind of expect, after hearing the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, all the other stories have said, and so the people cried out to God for help. It doesn't happen here in this story. This time we hear nothing about the people of God crying out to him for him to step in and deliver them. It's like they don't care anymore. This pattern of behavior has become so normal to them that they have become accustomed to it. We see it that God's people have come to kind of accept the Philistines as their overlords. They don't really care if God steps in or not. And yet, here it is. God stepping in. I think many of us can relate to this. We're not as earnest as we ever should be. And yet, despite all this, notice that God still graciously intervenes. Though the people don't cry out to him for help, God still steps in to redeem his people. This is amazing, amazing grace. Isn't this what we call the gospel, the good news of Jesus? That the Son of God, Jesus, never stepped into our world because we cried out to him to ask him to do that. He stepped in on his own initiative to bring freedom and hope to people who had actually turned their back on him. We weren't looking for him or to him, but he showed up anyway, and he rescues. In fact, you could almost look at Samson and Jesus in some similar ways as well. Both have a miraculous birth. Both of them are betrayed by someone close to them who acted as a friend. Both were handed over to foreign oppressors. Both were tortured and chained. Both were put on public display. Both died with their hands outstretched. But Samson wasted his life out of revenge and sexual indulgence. Jesus' life and death were all about God's purpose. And his life and death is able to deliver the entire world and bring hope and life to you and me. See, God always acts in a way to save. And to have that applied to our lives, to have that applied to your life, you need to kind of apply that to, God, would you know you can do this? You've kind of stepped in out of the blue, even without me asking, stepped into this world to live and to die on my behalf. I want to be part of what you're doing in this world. That's how it starts. What an amazing God. That in his grace and in his sovereignty, he can do such things. That he can work with less than ideal circumstances. He can embrace people with wasted lives. So Samson's story can be viewed from kind of different perspectives, can't it? As we read it from kind of a gospel lens, we can celebrate how God embraces people with wasted lives. But there's another area I think we need to grasp, especially when we look at this tragedy of a wasted life. I think there's another perspective the writer of the story is wanting us to grasp here. See, on the surface, someone might describe Samson's story as an example to us about the dangers of falling prey to temptation and how we might not realize our full potential for God. Might highlight the way that, we can, when we're tempted and we kind of give in to temptation, lead to embarrassment and humiliation and pain and death. And so I'm sure a preacher could say something like, if we want to realize our full potential for God, we must avoid temptation. And that would be true. But of course, it's much easier said than done, isn't it? I wonder if we can sit back for a moment, though, and ask another question. Why did this happen? Why did a man with so much potential and promise live a wasted life? Why did he fail to achieve all that was possible? And I think the answer the story gives to us is that Samson never really understood. He never really embraced the purpose God had for him. He had so much potential and promise, but he wasted it because he didn't embrace God's purpose for his life. As one person I read this week said, ultimately this is a story about a deliverer that never discovers his purpose in life and ends up beginning the deliverance of a people who never asked to be delivered. Throughout his story, began so well. Right at the beginning, there are hints that Samson is not going to embrace his purpose, and I want you to grasp this. See, when people go to a counselor for problems, it's kind of stereotypical now, isn't it, to know that the mum is going to be to blame for all the problems in this person's life. This is one of the few incidences when that's actually true. Effectively, Mrs. Manoah failed to tell Samson the reason God was bringing him into the world. Let me read a couple of passages. I want you to see if you can spot the differences between what is said and what is passed on. This is what the angel said to Mrs. Manoah. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, even though you've been unable to have children, you'll soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. So be careful. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink or eat any forbidden food. You will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut. For he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines. Now listen to what Mrs. Manoah reports and see if you can spot the differences. The woman ran and told her husband, a man of God appeared to me. He looked like one of God's angels, terrifying to see. I didn't ask him where he was from. He didn't tell me his name, but he told me, you will become pregnant and give birth to a son. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden fruit. For your son will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from the moment of his birth until the day of his death. Do you see any glaring omissions? She focuses on the first part of the angel's message, what she was supposed to do. In her excitement, she doesn't tell her husband the second part of the angel's message about why God is making her son a Nazirite. She omits the reference to Samson being God's deliverer for the nation. It's as if she didn't even hear the why. No wonder later in the story, her husband Manoah doesn't seem to have a clue about the boy's career. When the angel returns, he asks, now, when this announcement comes true, how should the child be raised and what should he do? He doesn't have a clue about the mission that God has for his boy. Oddly, the angel doesn't answer the question. He just says this, your wife should pay careful attention to everything, is kind of the underlying part in the Hebrew language, to everything that I have said. I think he's telling Manoah that his wife needs to recall all that was said before and that the answer to his question can be found there. Mrs. Manoah seems to ignore her son's purpose in life. So Samson is about to grow up as a Nazirite without a clearly defined reason for his being a Nazirite in the first place. You see, details like this are the way the original Hebrew authors made their point when writing. It was the way they would kind of highlight, this is what I'm trying to tell you. I think it's good for us to kind of focus on this part of the story for a moment. Sure, Samson knew he was a Nazirite. He knew that he needed to follow certain rules and regulations, but that wasn't enough. And it's never enough. He needed to know that God had made him a Nazirite for a larger purpose, to deliver Israel. Without having that in front of him and having a commitment to this larger purpose, his awareness of his Nazirite status would never be enough to sustain him when temptation would come his way, as it would. The rules must have seemed pointless to him, especially when he came across that delicious honey, both the literal and the metaphorical kind, waiting to be eaten. Without an understanding of this larger purpose that he had as Israel's deliverer, he would view his struggles with the Philistines as simply a way to get personal revenge. Now, we can't blame Mrs. Manoah for all this. I think God was patient with Samson. I think Samson has every opportunity to kind of become aware of his status, aware of his purpose. He has this abnormal strength, this ability that God has given to him for some reason. God has even led him into certain situations where he has taken on the Philistines. This amazing strength that he has kind of come through. You'd think that Samson would understand all this. That he would understand he has a purpose beyond just personal vendetta. But he has so much potential and promise, and he wastes it because he didn't embrace God's purpose for his life. As we saw earlier, we have a lot in common with Samson. You've been chosen by God even before your birth. You've been set apart to serve him. You've been blessed by his Spirit. You've been given supernatural abilities. You have a special purpose. And like Samson, you have a special relationship with God through his son, Jesus Christ. And this relationship makes, certain demands on your behavior. But I wonder if it's possible that some of us miss the part about God's purpose and focus solely on the list of behaviors. I think that's Samson, isn't it? Samson's aware of his Nazirite vow. He's taught that he wasn't supposed to eat or drink certain things. He's supposed to stay away from dead bodies. He's, not meant to cut his hair. These were the traits of a Nazirite. Samson knew all that. But when you don't grasp the reason for your distinct life, when you fail to see a higher calling and purpose behind all this, all you see is the list of do's and don'ts. And ultimately, you miss the whole point of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. I wonder if some of us here would identify ourselves as a Christian but fail to realize why Jesus has called us to be his followers. So you end up viewing Christianity primarily as a list of all these moral rules and regulations designed to kind of keep you from experiencing happiness in life. So when you're tempted, you eat the sweet honey offered to you in whatever form it's in. You take it because there's no reason for you to resist it. Samson needed to know that he was called by God to be Israel's deliverer. If he had known that, he would have realized that these rules and regulations around him were designed to mark him out as a special, distinct person on this mission that God had for him. You and I need to know that we have a special calling in life. The New Testament puts it in a whole lot of different words, like here in St. Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 2 says, after reminding us about our calling and all these gifts that we have, he says that, here's the reason, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. It's a clearly stated purpose. He points to the light and hope of this new kingdom, to this King Jesus, and says he's called you, he's given you this purpose. And so he then in his letter goes and says, I want you to live differently in your marriage. I want you to be different in your friendships and your jobs and the choices you make in life, because all of this points its way to who Jesus is, and you declare the light of Jesus in the darkness of the world around you. Jesus puts his mission this way: as the Father has sent me, so I send you. Well, how did Jesus articulate his purpose in life? Well, he spoke about it in his first public sermon. He said, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because he's anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. We sum it up here in our mission as a church of renewing people and renewing places, that we partner with Jesus to do what he's doing in the world. That's why throughout history, followers of Jesus have launched hospitals in places where there were no hospitals. They started schools where there were no schools. They began the YMCAs. They fought for the freedom of slaves. They began organizations like the SPCA. They advocated for change in their work conditions. They founded many of the world's top universities. They elevated the status of women. They raised children in distinct ways. They began youth groups. They gave sacrificially to various ministries and missions in their own churches. All of this at great, great cost to themselves. See, God has not just given you a bunch of rules so you can pass some test and become a religious person of some kind. His commands to us about how we're meant to live fit into this larger purpose he has for us. And when you grasp that larger purpose, that the lifestyle given to us in the New Testament begins to make some sense. That we're able to do something because God has called us to be something so much more. But trying to keep a bunch of rules without this knowledge of this larger God-given purpose will never work for any of us. If you just go through life with this attitude, I'm a Christian, that means I don't do certain things, I think you'll end up like Samson. You need to put your life in proper perspective. When temptation comes up and you're tempted to take that forbidden honey, you don't say, I can't do that because I'm a Christian and Christians don't do that. I think you say, as the Father sent Jesus into the world, so he's sending me. I'm on a bigger assignment to renew people and places. I'm here to signpost what God is doing in the world and who God is. My life needs to point to the hope, authenticity, truth, generosity, hospitality, empowerment, inclusivity, these values we have on our walls. I love the way one pastor reminds people about what his job is. And this video we're about to see isn't just about a pastor's job, it's about all of us. Take a moment to capture again some of that purpose and mission as J. Johns describes what we do.
People often say to me, they say, J. John, what do you do? And it's always very difficult to know what to say. Because if I say to you that I'm a reverend, which I am, that conjures up certain images in people's minds as to what I might be. So I like to be a little bit creative in telling people what I do. I sat next to this lady on an aeroplane at Heathrow Airport, and I said, hello. And she said, well, hello. And I said, where are you going? And she says, I'm going to Singapore. Then she said to me, where are you going? I said, I'm going to Australia. I said, what do you do? So she told me. Then she said, what do you do? And I said, well, I work for a global enterprise. She said, do you? I said, yes, I do. I said, we've got outlets in nearly every country of the world. She said, have you? I said, yes, we have. I said, we've got hospitals and hospices and homeless shelters. I said, we do marriage work. We've got orphanages. We've got feeding programs, educational programs. I said, we do all sorts of justice and reconciliation things. I said, basically, we look after people from birth to death, and we deal in the area of behavioral alteration. She went, wow! And it was so loud, her wow, loads of people turned around and looked at us. She says, what's it called? I said, it's called the church. And that's it really, isn't it? If we are a follower of Jesus, then we are part of a global enterprise. But not only is it global, it's intergalactic because it includes everyone that's gone before us. Wow.
So you get it? It's kind of time for us, I think, to seize a bigger purpose in front of us. All of us here are potential lion killers, but all of us also have a potential sweet tooth. And God can and wants to accomplish great things through us. But that sweet tooth will distract you from realizing your full potential if you don't grasp the bigger calling and potential that God has. Don't waste your life. Be part of something so much bigger. I'm going to ask the ushers to come forward now and to take our bread and cup and pass it around. If you're a follower of Jesus, I just invite you to hold the bread and a cup in your hand. The band is going to come up and lead us in an item as we kind of just reflect on today's talk and what this means for you and me. As we hold the elements, as we hear the song, there's going to be parts where we remember kind of the broken vessels that we are and the way God wants to step in and renew our own lives by His grace. I think He also wants to invite you and me to be part of what He's doing to mend the broken vessels, the lives of people around us. Again, earlier in these messages, we've heard all these different aspects happening around us. Youth suicide, alcohol abuse, family violence, homelessness. Today, this whole thing of sex trafficking. These are big issues. And we could easily put a list of another 20 or 30 of them really easily. Raising up a generation that's equipped to serve God. What can you do about that? Ensuring our ministries and missions here are in a healthy financial state. Something you can begin being part of as well. It might be issues that you hear in our church, our country, our society, your work, neighborhood, family of origins, personal habits. What are the patterns that need breaking? What do you think the Spirit of God is whispering to you today? As the Father has sent me, Jesus said, so I am sending you. What's He calling you to be part of? So you hold this bread and this cup, just ask that question. Do you allow God to mend your own soul? He also invites you to be part of what He's doing in the world around you. So just hold the elements. I'll come forward after the song. We'll pray together before we finish with our